Hi, I'm Andy Peck McLean. I'm the pastor of the Washington Grove United Methodist Church. Good to be with you today. Bonnie has started us off in Genesis with talking about gender and sexuality, homosexuality as well. I'm going to pick that up in Romans, but first give some overview about the book of Romans before we get into specific passages. The book of Romans was written to Roman believers, Roman followers. They wouldn't have even called themselves Christians at that point, we don't think, but they were followers of this new Jesus movement and people who had been affected by Paul. Throughout the letter of Romans, there's a theme of God's righteousness. We hear it in verses 16 and 17 in chapter 1, where Paul writes, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith. As it is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith." N.T. Wright, a New Testament scholar, lifts that up in his article in the New Interpreter's Bible. Others as well, this theme of God's righteousness or God's justice that moves throughout the book of Romans. It's revealed in the death and resurrection of Jesus, and Paul is not ashamed to come back to Rome, which is also home to the empire, home to Caesar, and proclaim that Caesar is not Lord, but Jesus is. Paul wrote this in the mid to late 50s, first century, not the 1950s. It was probably written in Corinth, which is nearby, before he was going on a final trip to Jerusalem. He wanted to communicate with the Romans. We don't know if there was a specific incident, but clearly there was conflict between the Gentile followers and the Jewish followers, and how God worked through that, how they should be as followers of Christ. So connecting this to Genesis chapter 3, turn, if you have a Bible in front of you, to chapter 1, verse 21. I'm going to read 21 and 22. "For they knew God, though they did not honor him as God." And then skipping to 22. "Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human being, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles." People who are smarter than I and study this better kind of see that Paul is retelling Genesis chapter 3, bringing in the serpent that fooled Adam and Eve, as well as images of Israel in the wilderness. We hear that in the mortal human beings and birds and four-footed animals or reptiles. The snake falls into that category. But I also think about the Israelites in the wilderness building a golden calf. Right? They made an idol. They made an image for God, worshipped something other than God. And Paul lifts that up in the beginning part that we heard, that they did not honor God as God. So we have this connection to Genesis chapter 3, and then Paul gets into a list of different places where people's passions lead them the wrong way, you might say. And we're going to focus specifically on verses 26 and 27. Here's where I'm going to pick up halfway through verse 26. "Their women exchanged natural intercourse for unnatural, and in the same way also the men, giving up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another." So what do we make of this? There's different ways to interpret this or understand this. N.T. Wright from the New Interpreter's Bible says that the existence of homosexual practice in a culture is a sign that the culture as a whole has been worshiping idols, and that its God-given male and female order is being fractured as a result. He ties in that same-sex living to the idolatry of not worshiping God first and foremost, not living as one was created to be. In the People's New Testament commentary, Eugene Boring and Fred Craddock give a different view. They list off a few different points, so here's one of them. "Christian ethical perspective on homosexuality is a complex subject," they say, "involving legal, social, psychological, and medical points of view, as well as theological and biblical statements." So you can't just quote a few biblical texts, they say. There's a whole lot going on here in this passage and in other parts of Scripture we need to understand the whole from all those different perspectives. They also point out that the concept of homosexuality as a sexual orientation, as a way that's not chosen by the person, but is who they are, received as a part of God's creation, they write, was unknown by Paul, and many at that time, I'll add. For it is very likely that for Paul, and this is me speaking now, not Borean and Craddock, men having sex with men was not men spending lives together with men. The idea that you could love someone in the way that a man loved a woman and be with them in relationship, ideally for life, that was not something that was really conceived of by people with same-sex relations at the time that Paul is writing. I just want to close with a story about how I got here. I grew up in the New York Annual Conference. I grew up in the Hudson Valley, north of New York City. And as a high schooler, I found myself into the Conference Council on Youth Ministries. Baltimore, Washington, New York Annual Conference. All the United Methodist conferences have a Conference Council on Youth Ministries. And I was really nurtured and supported by other pastors in that time and encouraged to explore my gifts, possibly into ordained ministry. Went to an Exploration 92 event with other young people, teenagers, who were thinking about ministry. Some of those folks that guided me and nurtured me were lesbian. I didn't know it at the time, but they cared for me. They helped encourage me. Even I remember having a conversation with one during seminary where I said, I can't be a part of this denomination that is discriminating against, more than that, people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual. And she told me, I get that. If that's your decision, then you need to make that decision, Andy. And we also need people to help be a part of bringing a different culture into the United Methodist Church. So they never pushed me. They wanted me to include loving God and others as a possible vocation as a teenager, which is not easy to do. As a 16-year-old, you tell it to your friends in class, not the best conversation starter, in physics class. But for me, I wouldn't be here as an ordained clergy person were it not for women who love women as part of who they are. I imagine some of you might have stories similar to that. I imagine there are plenty of places we can discuss. So I want to move us into some time for discussion now. And thank you for spending time with me today.